Hey guys, how's it going? Valk here. So one of the most common questions and requests I'd get on stream and during coaching sessions is, how do I build my heroes like yours? And can you make a guide on that? Well, aside from like the obvious, far more gear, right? The only thing I always recommend for people, if they want to play very competitively, is to learn to work with Fribbel's Optimizer. So it's a program made by Fribbels in the community, who has now since moved on from the community, but definitely won't be forgotten. The program essentially takes your game data from your emulator, right? Also all of your gears and heroes, and organizes it into a database for you to look through and lets you put together builds based on your stat requirements. It's a very useful tool for a good chunk of like the competitive player base, and a lot of people use it. So to properly qualify myself for this guide, right? I'm a top 150-ish player every season that I've played RTA, starting season 3, with one legend finish during season 6. And one of the biggest things that helped me push past that like hurdle is learning to optimize my gear distribution via Fribbel's Optimizer, taught to me by my friend Kamikita. He also loves the program a lot, and I think every chance we get, we talk about these stats and numbers all the time. So if you're interested, his stream link will be in the description down below. But that aside, I would say once your account goes over about 400 pieces of gear, Fribbels become a lot more helpful. Even if you don't fit that bill or want to learn how to, put all these numbers together just to gear your units, I think it's still a very helpful third-party equipment manager just to make it easier for you to organize your gear and all that stuff. It really helps you learn the nitty-gritty of what each stat can mean and how much each stat is worth in terms of their value in the game. So the one disclaimer I will make before I begin is that this app resides in a very gray area for the TOS, but a huge amount of the player base use it as an external gear manager, so do proceed at your own risk. But with that out of the way, here's my guide on optimizing your Epic 7 account using Fribbel's Optimizer. So before I get into the detail on the app itself, I just want to give 3 quick tips to get you guys in the right mindset. Tip number 1, give your full trust to the robot. So everyone starts gearing their account manually, right? If you're really keen with numbers especially, you might even remember exactly what pieces are on what hero, and you're very attached to those pieces. I was very much the same before I started. But if you're going to get into Fribbels, the number 1 thing to keep in mind is that you have to trust the robot to be able to build better heroes than you, and you shouldn't try to mentally keep or greed certain pieces of gear on heroes based on preference. You just kind of have to trust that you know what you're doing with the optimization process, and you have to trust the robot to be able to outmath you. Tip number 2, learn what the ratings are. So the ratings are advanced metrics that automatically combine stats that are already there in the game and gives you a bigger picture on how those numbers can work. For example, instead of trying to imagine how tanky my 30k HP, 1500 defense Fallen Cecilia is, the robot will just tell me it's approximately 181k effective HP, and which is also known as EHP. So by looking at EHP, it'll give you a better understanding of how tanky a unit can be. And there are a lot of other ratings like that, which I'll explain later. Tip number 3, learning to optimize is a skill, and skills are something to improve upon. No one starts out good at this, and even for myself, when I first started learning to use the optimizer, my builds were not clean at all, and I didn't know the best way to prioritize my units. But over time, as I used the program more, I naturally got better at understanding how to prioritize my builds. So I imagine for anyone without 300 IQ, like, they'll have to go through something similar. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what this process is like, let's get started. If there's any sections you're already well acquainted with when it comes to Fribbels, I should have the chapters marked on the progress bar, so feel free to skip any part if you already know what I'm going to talk about there. So by following the installing instructions in the link to the optimizer in the description, and by installing all the prerequisite programs, you should arrive at this window when you launch Fribbel's E7 optimizer. So before you import all of your builds, what I would recommend is going to the Heroes tab and add all the heroes you will be optimizing for. Especially prioritize your PvP heroes, heroes that require really good gear. Make sure to add the bonus stats for each hero, artifact levels, and imprints properly when you do this. It really helps when you want to squeeze that extra bit of stats needed to complete a build sometimes. And this is something I would absolutely recommend if you plan on using Fribbel's Optimizer as a long-term equipment manager. Next, you want to go to the Importer tab. Under Import Heroes and Gear Automatically, get ready to import your gears and builds. So this process has an instruction, but We'll just go through it really quickly. So what you want to do is click Start Scanning. You want to pull up your emulator and just launch the game normally. Once the game is launched and you arrive at your lobby, you can go ahead and click Stop Scanning. Let the optimizer load in your data real quick. And once all your items are loaded in, go ahead and export that. Save it as whatever you wish. And once it's exported, go ahead and merge data. So you want to merge the same file you just exported back into the optimizer. And there you go. All of your gear and the heroes they're on should be properly imported into the optimizer. I think one super underrated aspect of the optimizer is the fact that you can use it to filter through your gear bank via gear sets, main and substats, and gear score. This is actually a feature I use very often to help me figure out what to craft, what slots to craft, and when I should be more forgiving towards gear, or when I should be raising my gear requirement. And it's also something I do to immediately get to know people's accounts when they ask me to coach them. For example, you can see my necklace slot is very short on speed, especially on speed set, where it suddenly just completely drops off. That has been and will be something I'm searching for in the future. Now that we have Epic Craft, using this feature to figure out where you should be epic crafting and where to convert gear can really help accelerate the gearing curve for new players immensely. And it's a method I use and definitely recommend to anybody else. Now, before I explain how to actually use the darn optimizer, I figure I might as well do the segment where I explain each abbreviation, because there's going to be a lot of them, and a lot of people talk about them in the community, and I get asked about them all the time. So you can see that you can hover over the question mark and actually read the description for them, but we're gacha gamers, and it's like, who reads? So one of the most important metrics is score, which is just gear score. And what that is basically scaling to a max roll per substat, how high your gear rolls are. And it's the easiest way to basically at a glance tell if a piece of gear is good or not. The easiest way to calculate gear score is just remember speed is worth 2 points, crit is worth 1.6, 1.5 if you just like to do head math, and crit damage is worth 1.14, and you can just call it 1.1 if you want to be lazy with it. Every other stat is worth about 1 to 1. Flat stats depends on the unit the gear is on, so that'll always change. For example, flat defense is really good on Violet and Landy, while it's terrible on mages since they have base defense very high. Flat HP is usually really good on mages because they have terrible base HP, but on units like ARavi and Ruel, they really don't get any value at all. At level 90, gear caps out at 85 gear score normally, so scaling your gear score out of 85 will tell you how good a piece of gear is. A good way to benchmark your gear score is 65 would be a good point to aim for left side gear, and 60 for right side gear. Now, if you're more of like a spender on the game, then it's +5 to both of those metrics. So for left side, I would probably aim for 65 plus for right side, and 70 plus for the left. But honestly, if you're a new player, whatever gear you got that's an upgrade, you should honestly just take. Now, most of these stats on the left side are just their in-game stats, so it should be pretty self-explanatory. As far as these scores over here, C score is combat score and indicates pretty good bruiser gear. So any stat that's not effectiveness or FRES is a combat stat. So this category will usually look kind of stacked. D score is DPS score, and it only takes DPS stats, right? Like attack, crit damage, and speed. Flat attack as well. But since there are some pieces that can't roll attack like chess pieces, this category will usually look a little bit low when you look at the D score. S score is support score, and this will generally be people's weakest category since it doesn't include any damage stats. This is where you find gears for tanks, debuffers, and support units, since those are usually builds that have a lot of flat stats. They generally tend to look the thinnest out of all of the gear score categories, especially in swords where they can't roll defense. Now in the optimizer tab, you'll also have a lot of these abbreviations as well. Outside of the ones you'll see in the game, some of the ones you might notice are EHP, which is, as mentioned earlier, it's effective HP. It's an aggregate of your HP and defense stat. EHPS is the same as EHP, but it's subdivided over your speed. And I would say it's important for units like Amelia and C. Lilius, where they also need to be fast, but, tanky. They want to be both fast and tanky. HPS is kind of like EHPS, but it doesn't consider defense, and it only takes HP over speed. And I would, like, just off the top of my head, the number one unit I would think to use HPS would be like Last Rider Crow, and maybe Troublemaker Crozet. MCD is just your attack multiplied by your crit damage percentage, and it always assumes your attack crits. It's what most players use to scale their damage. MCDS, same thing, but you're kind of putting it over speed. You want to use this for things like Pavel, Assassin Sid, and Landy once you're past speed threshold. DMG is like MCD, but it factors in your crit rate. And I would say it's useful for when you have a build that has a hard time reaching 100% crit. It kind of gives you an idea of how much crit you can sacrifice to be able to make it worth the value that you're getting out of your other stats. And it really helps you figure out which build gives you that like value, especially when you potentially miss crit in some games. Now DMGS is just the same thing, again over speed. DMGH is a little bit different, it's HP scaling damage. I would use this to build HP scaling bruisers like Alencia and ARavi. And of course we already know gear score. Prio is priority. Basically, it will tell you which stat line most closely resembles to this thing you have on the right. If you're really good with these markers and you know what your gear is like, sometimes Prio is what gives you the cleanest stats. It's a very underrated feature that not a lot of people use, but it will sometimes give you the best builds. UPG is upgrades, and it tells you how many upgrades the builds need, right? So how many reforges. So if you want to save reforge material for level 90 builds, you can, you know, kind of put a limit on this, maybe like 1 piece or 2 pieces, right? So that the optimizer doesn't include builds that use too many of these. And that's essentially all the terminologies you need to know when working on builds on the optimizer. And now that we have all the common terminologies out of the way, we can get on with the process. So the next step you can skip if you only want to optimize a few units. But if you build your entire account in Fribbels like I do, I would recommend building a priority for your heroes to help prioritize which units get your best gear. And that bases off of 2 rules. 1, which units do I pick the most? And 2, what gears are the rarest for me? So it's like trying to balance supply and demand. For me, speed gear is the rarest for me, so I gear my units that need to be fast first, especially the ones that I pick very often. And then after that, I will go down my entire list of units I'm looking to build and compare and contrast who I'd want better gear on. So my own account is built to play every single playstyle, but mostly focusing on aggro, which means I tend to be slightly faster than the builds with more damage, but a lot of my units tend to suffer in terms of bulk. Right now, we'll go through my list of priorities for my units for this season very quickly. Feel free to pause if you need to sample any of the stats. If you want to know the exact prio and stats I use, my Fribbel save is available to my subscribers on my Twitch. If you want to grab it real quick, feel free to just pop in and drop a Prime sub. Just make sure to link your Discord to your Twitch, and you should have access to my subs only channel on my Discord, and just grab it. Do keep in mind my unit priority is made for my unit pool and the gear I have available, and it's kind of tailor-made to my playstyle. It's probably something, you know, a lot of players can emulate, but if you're not used to playing this playstyle, it might feel a little bit awkward in the wrong hands. Okay, now we have priority out the way, I can get into the meat of this guide, which is the optimization process. So for this guide, I'll be showing 3 examples. We'll be building Landy, Adventurer Ross, and ARavi. So that will be a speed DPS, a tank, and a bruiser. 3 very common heroes, each with a different archetype, so hopefully that demonstrates what each part of the process will be like. Okay, starting off with Landy. For something like Landy, because I play aggressively and I like speed Landy, normally I look for something like 255 speed. And because she's a DPS, right, I usually look for hitting near max crit on her. Now, I don't care for having 100 crit. I'm okay with missing crit sometimes. Usually my drafts can cover my weaknesses like that. I tend to leave my crit window at 99 to 106. This guarantees that I get as close to 100 as possible, and I'm always within 1 roll of 100, so I'm not wasting a roll of stats. In terms of EHP, I'm generally looking for 46,500. So this is something where you're gonna have to play the game quite a bunch to kind of figure out where you're comfortable. What this number means to me is that if I have to play her into Rimuru, most people's Rimuru will not be able to kill her off of one S2 activation, right? So when he shoots out his little S2 passive, my Landy generally survive as long as the Rimuru isn't somehow set up with attack buff. And yeah, so over the seasons, I think since like season 6 when I ran the speed Landy like this, my Landy's only ever died to 2 people's Rimuru, so I'm pretty comfortable with that. As far as MCD goes, I run about 10k. 10k is essentially kind of where I feel like, especially for the purpose of playing against Rimuru, soul burning Landy into a Rimuru twice, or rather soul burning S3 and then dropping the S3 twice into Rimuru at 10k MCD is kind of where I'm comfortable, essentially cleaving a Rimuru team with Landy. In terms of sets, right, I'm gonna put on speed set. Now I could put on crit set, but what that will do for me is it will kind of limit me off of some potentially very high gear score builds if I were to be on a broken set or another set. So I'm gonna leave the second set empty. In terms of exclusion, I'm gonna exclude pen set just to make sure I don't take any valuable pen set pieces. And usually, unless you change the settings a little bit, pen set will get a lot of value when it comes to the damage stats. And that's not something you wanna do on Landy, who's an AoE hero that doesn't benefit from pen set. In terms of neck, I'm just gonna check both the crit ones. Those are very high value and you can't go wrong using either one. As far as ring goes, we take the attack and obviously speed on boots. And before we run it, just to kind of copy what stats we're looking for on the left, I'm going to deprioritize rather, F and res, max out my crit, max out my speed, 2 ticks of damage and attack, and we're gonna leave HP and defense where they're at. We are going to set our top percentage of gear that the optimizer is gonna pull from. Usually, my preference is to look for 10 billion permutations. Now, I understand not everyone's going to have the same hardware. If you have a supercomputer, you can obviously just do as many permutations as you want. And if you're on an older setup for your computer, maybe do like 1 billion permutation. Just know that when you do more permutations, you're casting a wider net, and it's gonna help you look for more valuable builds. Up here, we're gonna use Reforge stats, use hero priority, which is why setting a hero priority is so important, and we're gonna use equip items as well. So what that combination of buttons does is it lets us take any gear that is less important than Landy and essentially use it in our Landy build. And now that we have this set up, let's run it. Okay, and so, you know, with our numbers, right, this gave me about 1,000 results out of 9 billion searches. If it's not giving you the results, right, don't use these numbers like mine, right? Especially if you have a newer account, definitely lower the numbers to kind of something what you're, closer to what you're looking for. So normally when you do a process like this, a lot of people like to do something like this. They'll put in 1,000 defense and 10k HP. Now usually that's fine, but what this will do is it will potentially eliminate some results that are very high value. For example, if I can get a very good result at like maybe 999 defense, and it just go way higher in terms of HP, right? Obviously, I'll be a lot tankier, but those results get limited. So instead of doing that, we're just going to put in this number, right? 43333. But also, I know I like 46,500 in terms of EHP, so we're gonna keep that. And in terms of attack, right? For like a very aggressive Landy, I know a lot of people like to do like 3,300 and then 260, right? And instead of doing that, we can just punch in 8580, right? Let the robot do the math for you. That is the most important thing. We're using this to save brain power. So we can either put in 8580 or, you know, for me personally, I know the damage I like to play at is 10k MCD. So we're gonna put that in and we're gonna delete these lines. Okay, now that we have all of our results pulled up, what we're gonna do is look through our bracket of stats. So with this stat line, I can go as fast as 263, and obviously my bottom is 255. In terms of MCDS, we can go about as high as 10k 600, which is pretty nice for something like a Landy where she's also a little bit tanky as well. As far as EHP goes, because I do like her to be fast, so we're gonna search by EHPS. This tells me I can get very tanky. We can go potentially up to a 57, so there's a lot of room to grow in terms of bulk. not a whole lot to move in terms of damage. And this begins to process what I call the squeeze, right? So we're gonna bump up these numbers and move them up side by side, just bit by bit until we hit a point where we're very satisfied. So I'm gonna pull up to 49k EHP, which is a very comfortable bulk point for speed DPS. And this tells me the highest MCD I'm going to get at this level is about 10k 400. So now I'm gonna do this little cheeky thing where, in order to make sure I get some of the best builds, I'm gonna squeeze my gear score. I would say normally a good point to squeeze a gear score on a newer account is like if you're 360 or 380, but because my account is like pretty end game, I'm gonna go very, very greedy with it. This is something you do for pretty much heroes that need almost every stat. I would say for like bruisers or borderline bruisers, like a fast Landy, that's kind of where you want to go with this. But otherwise, that's not a necessary thing, especially for support units that usually don't see a lot of gear score. So after all things considered, we kind of have this build, right? Which is decently nice, but I think it's a little bit slow. I want my Landy to be 260 if possible. So we're gonna squeeze up her speed a little bit. After everything, we have these two builds to pull from. So we can either do this or this. Obviously, this is the better build, but this does take away my Spectre Tenebria boots, and I'm not sure I want to do that. And it also wastes one more point of crit. You know, you compare these two stat lines, they're not that different, and I would much prefer keeping my Spectre Tenebria on her boots. So we're going to go with this build, which is my current active build. And that's kind of how I arrive at these points when I build these heroes. Okay, now we're gonna build Adventurer Ross. So to start, because I play very aggressive, I'm definitely looking for 230 speed. Now, if you're a newer player or your account doesn't have a lot of like speed or support gear, I would say as long as you're 200 speed, he should be fine. But because he's what we consider like a tempo knight, right? He's pretty good with speed. His S2s kind of help your carries, you know, get a pseudo turn, right, with that dual attack. I would say like 200, 215 is fine, depending on how you like to play, but my preference is 230. I know a lot of players play even faster than that. I've seen 245 speed, I've even seen 270 speed, right? Some people get pretty crazy with his build. But 230 is a sweet spot for me. I'm gonna put down 120 FRES. And on top of that, I'm probably gonna put 24k HP. Now, usually I don't like to use the HP filter, but because Adventurer Ross is somebody that carries Aureus, right? So his HP needs to be high in order to absorb damage for his allies. Usually for Aureus Knights, I put at least 24k to make sure they're not too squishy HP-wise. In terms of his EHP, I think Knights, tanks in particular, need to be about 150k, potentially more. As far as his build goes, I think I'm just going to run speed set, right, as usual. And instead of running broken sets, I'm going to click defense, HP, immunity, and res. And I think these are the premier support offsets. In terms of right side, it's got to be speed for boots, it's got to be HP for neck, and as far as ring goes, I'm going to check HP and FRES, just in case there's a clean build in there. And as far as substat prios go, we're going to max out the res, lower the min, lower crit and crit damage. We're going to put speed at 2 ticks, HP at 3, defense at 2. And we're gonna minimize attack as well. Now, if you're not looking to make your Adventurer Ross a PvP focus unit, what you can do instead is just drop the FRES and up the F to 1 tick. And you can even do this, right? So if you're building this specifically for PvE, right, delete the res line and make his F 85. 85 is going to make him very useful in expeditions, especially in Wyvern expeditions, where not only is he gonna be your tank, but he can also pull your carry. That aside, this is generally what I'm going to do. We're gonna put the permutation to around 10 billion. There we go, and then we're just gonna run it. Okay, and there are our results. So right now we have 73 results. Usually when my results are in the double digits, that tells me my numbers I have up top are very squeezed. Obviously, if you're not getting results with these, just start lowering your numbers until you do, and then start kind of putting them up until your results become squeezed. And that's something you kind of get better with over time. So there's a couple of ways we can sort this, right? Sorting by EHPS, we'll be getting a lot of 24k HP builds with higher defense. While that's really good when it comes to something like Adventure or Ross, but because he is an Aureus Knight, as mentioned earlier, we're most likely going to be sorting by HPS. So we're kind of comparing this with each other, and if you really can't decide, since, you know, a lot of these gears look pretty similar, right? What you can just do is go by Prio and just take the top build that you like. So sorting by Prio, we see 3 of them are at the highest Prio possible, so it's going to be one of these 3. And since I have one at 25k, which is, you know, the highest available HP count to absorb damage through Aureus, we're just going to be taking that. When all's said and done, right, we hit our equip and then we go next. Okay, so, and for the third and last heroes, I'm going to be demonstrating, it's going to be our ARavi. Once again, I'll be using very end game numbers for this demonstration, so if you're not getting any builds, feel free just to lower the numbers until you're okay with it. But as far as everything goes, right, ARavi has to be crit damage neck, right, especially on speed set for me, because I don't have gear for a destruction set. HP percentage ring and speed boots. That's almost always how it goes, right? We're gonna take speed set, and our secondary has to be a pen set. In terms of speed, I'm looking for at least 185. As far as crit goes, I like 100 crit on ARavi because she gets 30 crit for free, so we know we're not gonna have any crit issues. And on top of that, because of how impactful her S3 is to the result of the game, I never wanna miss a ARavi S3 crit. So we're just gonna max that out. As far as EHP goes, I would recommend at least 120k. You know, if you can't make that, drop it lower. But for my account, usually I start at 130k. And then for DAMGH, I would say start at 6,500 and then kind of squeeze upwards from there. And as far as HP goes, you don't have to have super high HP, but because she scales so well with HP, and now she's on Proof of Valor, I do like having her on a very high amount of HP. So we're gonna set that at 25k. I think for your average account, especially if you play Proof of Valor or if you pre-ban Huayang and you play something else, right? I would say like 21k, 22k is serviceable, although it's probably preferable for you to have more. When we're good there, we're gonna max out HP, put 2 ticks into crit ray, because she already gains 30% crit passively, so we're telling the robot to not look for gear that has too much crit ray. Max out crit damage, 1 tick of speed, or 1 tick of defense, 2 ticks of speed. Attack can stay neutral, but F and res, we want to make sure we tell the robot to not look for them at all, because ARavi is a very gear score heavy character. She wants the best gear she could get her hands on to make an impact on the game. And then as far as top percentages go, this gives us about 10 billion searches, so let's run it. Okay, so now we got a pretty healthy list of heroes. If you're really lazy and you just want the best build, honestly, you can just take highest DMGH, just slam that. But now if you're kind of interested in wanting to optimize your ARavi a little bit, let's kind of see where we can go with this, right? So we see a lot of builds at 132k EHP. Let's just run that in. And then we see a lot of these builds kind of at 290, 300-ish crit damage. We can just set a bottom crit damage just to make sure we're not getting too low in terms of damage. Now, from this point on, everything is very heavily preference-based. If you want higher damage, you can obviously take the highest damage build. But I'm not sure I'm comfortable with less than 1200 defense. ARavi is one of those units that are very tanky, and because of her passive, she heals a lot. And, you know, healing usually scales with defense, because the higher your defense, the more your healing back is worth. So I actually don't want to go too low on defense. But instead of putting in more defense, right, let's think about raising our EHP. So let's see, I'm like scrolling down a little bit. I see a lot of builds still at 137k, so let's just take that, right? So while looking at our highest DMGH, this is all of our builds, right? Now 2 builds stand out to me. This current one with 8900 DMGH, which tells me that's my highest damaging build, and this one in the green right here, which is going to be my tankiest build. Comparing these 2 builds, this one lacks a little bit more damage, and this one has good enough damage but lacks some defense. Between these two, thinking about it, most of my time, ARavi is most likely threatened by units like Hwayoung, where the HP is more important. So comparing these two, I actually prefer the one with the higher HP, so we're going to take this live build. And that's kind of how I arrive at my stats for my builds. So between all the squeezing, you do take a lot of time to kind of think about what units you play against with these units and what will help them more in these matchups. And there you have it. Just, you know, repeat the same process from the top to the bottom of the list for all of the heroes that you kind of want to optimize for, and you'll have like a very competitive roster with your gear pool. And all that left for you to do is go in game and put on the gear manually. As cool as the program is, there isn't really a way to circumvent that process. Otherwise, it really is a huge competitive advantage, you know? And with that, that'll be my Fribbel's guide aimed at the features we have in July of 2022. If you found it helpful, please drop me a like and a sub. It's free and helps me make more content. If there's any build archetypes you think I should be able to make for a future video, go ahead and let me know in the comments down below, and I'll be happy to answer any questions as well. That'll be it from me in this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a great one, and stay safe out there, guys. See ya.